In 1950, Britain's economy was 80% larger than Germany's. By 2022, Germany's economy was 18% larger than Britain's. That's not a typo. The country that won the war lost the economic race to the country that lost the war. Both nations were devastated in 1945. Both received American aid. Both had access to the same Marshall Plan funds that everyone credits for Europe's recovery. Yet one rebuilt itself into an economic powerhouse, while the other slid into what historians now call managed decline. Here's the part nobody talks about. Britain actually received more Marshall Plan money than Germany, $2.7 billion compared to Germany's $1.6 billion. The difference wasn't the money, it was what they did with it. And that choice, made in the late 1940s while both countries were still digging themselves out of rubble, explains why your German car is probably more reliable than your British one ever was. The standard story you learned in school is a lie. They told you the Marshall Plan rebuilt Germany, that American money created the German economic miracle. Textbooks still teach it that way, but historians who actually study the period know better. The Marshall Plan accounted for less than 5% of Germany's national income during Reconstruction. It helped, sure, but it wasn't the cause. The real German miracle came from something far more boring than American generosity: sound money and deregulation. In 1948, Ludwig Erhard, Germany's Minister of Economics, did something radical. He slashed the money supply by 93% overnight, creating the Deutschmark and destroying the worthless Reichsmark that had people using cigarettes as currency. Then he removed most price controls and regulations. Businesses could operate freely, investment could flow to productive uses, the economy exploded. Britain took the opposite path. When the war ended, the Labour government nationalized everything in sight: railways, coal mines, steel, heavy industry, the Bank of England. The most controversial was steel, which was actually profitable, but ideology demanded public ownership. Britain created a comprehensive welfare state, launched the NHS, and promised cradle-to-grave care for all citizens. Noble goals, certainly. But here's the problem: Britain was bankrupt. The country had burned through virtually all its foreign currency reserves fighting the war. American Lend-Lease ended abruptly in September 1945, leaving Britain unable to pay for basic imports or even food. The U.S. loan that was supposed to last 4 years was nearly gone by 1947. Bread, never rationed during 6 years of war, had to be rationed in peacetime. Yet, despite facing finances resembling those of a defeated nation, Britain still saw itself as a global power, and that delusion cost everything. While Germany and Japan, freed from military commitments by their defeat, poured resources into factories and exports, Britain maintained an empire it could no longer afford. The military budget ran £200 million annually to keep 1.3 million people in uniform, operate combat fleets in 3 oceans plus Hong Kong, and fund 120 Royal Air Force squadrons across the globe. That's money that could have modernized industries, rebuilt infrastructure, invested in new technologies. Instead, it went to defending colonial possessions that were gaining independence anyway. The Marshall Plan money reveals the fundamental difference. Germany used it to rebuild productive capacity, factories, equipment, modern infrastructure. They invested in making things better and cheaper than anyone else. Britain spent it on imports, defending the value of sterling and maintaining global prestige. France and Germany electrified their railways and modernized transportation. Britain was still running steam engines and Victorian semaphore signals into the 1960s. The country that invented railways ended up slashing its network in the beaching cuts while European competitors expanded theirs. Britain, once the workshop of the world, just wasn't very good at making things anymore. The automobile industry tells the story perfectly. While German and Japanese firms carved out global markets with innovation and excellence, British Leyland became a punchline. The Austin Allegro, the Morris Marina, cars guaranteed to break down. Ask anyone old enough to remember, they'll smile sadly and mention the Robin Reliant, which at least made people laugh. This wasn't inevitable. Britain had skilled workers, engineering expertise, and established manufacturing. But decades of underinvestment, poor labor relations, and focus on short-term profits rather than long-term competitiveness destroyed what should have been world-class industries. The currency reform comparison is devastating. Germany's 1948 currency reform was painful. It wiped out savings overnight. But it gave people sound money they could trust, which enabled economic calculation, investment, and growth. Britain tried to defend sterling's value under the Bretton Woods system, tying itself to increasingly unsustainable exchange rates. The convertibility crisis of 1947 drained nearly $1 billion from British reserves in weeks. Devaluation in 1949 followed, then again later. Each devaluation increased import costs, squeezed living standards, and fueled inflation. Britain got trapped in a vicious cycle. Declining productivity made the currency weaker, which made imports more expensive, which drove inflation, which reduced competitiveness further. Here's the twist nobody expected. The psychological factor mattered more than anyone admits. Germany, utterly defeated, had no choice but to rebuild from scratch. Old attitudes, old policies, old institutions, all discredited by catastrophic failure. Business and labor became receptive to change. The government pushed through reforms that would have been politically impossible before the war. Defeat created space for transformation. Britain, victorious but exhausted, couldn't admit it needed fundamental change. The NHS and welfare state were immensely popular. Nationalization seemed like progress. Maintaining global commitments felt like preserving greatness. Every decision made sense politically. Cumulatively, they produced economic stagnation. By the 1960s, the gap was widening visibly. Living standards in Britain rose, GDP per capita tripled between 1950 and 1970, but European competitors were pulling ahead faster. The shocking part? British people didn't really notice. Absolute improvement masked relative decline. When you're getting richer every year in nominal terms, it's hard to see you're falling behind everyone else. Unemployment stayed low, wages increased, life got better than the 1930s depression or wartime austerity. Why worry that Germany and France were growing faster? But compound those differential growth rates over decades, and the result is transformative. Industries that should have been British became German. Technologies that could have been British became Japanese. Markets that wanted British goods learned to buy elsewhere. The tragic irony is that Britain had every advantage Germany lacked. Britain won the war. It kept its institutions intact. Its cities, while bombed, weren't devastated like German ones. It had empire resources, the English language advantage, established trade relationships, financial expertise. Yet it squandered those advantages through choices that prioritized consumption over investment, prestige over productivity, and political popularity over economic reality. Germany, starting from total ruin with none of those advantages, chose differently. Sound money, industrial investment, export focus, long-term thinking. Within a generation, Germany had not just recovered, but surpassed Britain economically. The lesson isn't that welfare states don't work. Germany developed its own generous social system. It's not that government involvement is inherently bad. German ordoliberalism included active state participation. The lesson is simpler and more brutal. You can't sustain consumption you haven't earned through production. Britain tried to maintain great power status, build a welfare state, and avoid industrial modernization simultaneously. The math didn't work. Germany focused ruthlessly on productive capacity first, knowing that prosperity would follow success in global markets. They were right. Britain was wrong. And the price of being wrong was watching the defeated enemy become the economic victor, while Land of Hope and Glory became a story of managed decline. The saddest part? It didn't have to be this way. The choices weren't inevitable. The outcomes weren't predetermined. Britain could have invested in modernization, could have accepted diminished global role earlier, could have prioritized productive investment over prestige spending. But that would have required political courage nobody possessed, admitting truths nobody wanted to hear, and making sacrifices nobody wanted to make. Easier to spend Marshall Plan money on imports than industrial equipment. Easier to defend sterling's value than accept devaluation. Easier to maintain empire commitments that admit they were unaffordable. Each easy choice made sense in isolation. Together, they guaranteed Germany would win the peace that Britain had won the war.